conducted. This past session, we had a near supermajority in both the House and the Senate. A near supermajority where we'll talk about various pieces of legislation that should have been no-brainers, things that are easy to do, but yet they didn't get done. In fact, we didn't even get hearings on them, didn't get votes on them. I'm going to give you a couple of examples kind of from my wheelhouse. The first of those is the question of strict constitutional limitations on spending. 94% of Republican primary voters say they strongly support constitutional limits on government growth. Now, that's not some poll somewhere. That's on the May 2012 Republican primary ballot. 94% of Republican primary voters say they want strict constitutional spending limits. Okay. I couldn't get 94% of you nice people to agree on what color this tablecloth is. And yet 94% of Republican primary voters say they want strict constitutional spending limits. The Texas House, led by Joe Straus, refused to have even a hearing on the issue. Not even a late night chit-chat over coffee about constitutional spending limits. Now, in the Texas Senate, we had a vote out of the Finance Committee. They sent it out of the Finance Committee thanks to State Senator Dan Patrick, but then Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst refused to move it forward for a vote. So we don't know who in the Senate is for us and against us on that issue. But again, in the House, not even the hearing, not even a discussion, let alone any sort of vote or records of who's for the issue and against the issue. Indeed, when we look at the process, we all don't want to talk about process. Process is messy. We want to talk about grand ideas, grandiose ideas. Well, grandiose ideas are implemented through process. And you look at the processes of the Texas House and the Texas Senate, and that's where we start finding that sometimes we've been fighting the right fights, but in the wrong ways. Because you look at the leadership. You have to look at the leadership of the Texas legislature. The rules of the Texas House, as Jim noted, isn't some Athenian democracy. It's all about leadership. Dictatorial, complete, total leadership is the way a legislative body works. And the Speaker of the House alone, through his own or her own actions and decisions, as well as those of the committee chairs, their lieutenants, get to decide what legislation lives and what legislation dies. They alone. There's no discharge process. There's no say. They individually get to decide. So who the Speaker is, the Speaker appoints the committee chairs without input from others. This doesn't have to happen. So those committee chairs are incredibly important. So legislation like spending limits that never gets a hearing, it's because the Speaker of the House made sure that he appointed committee chairs who would not even give a discussion on the issue. Leadership matters. 94% of Republican primary voters want strict constitutional spending limits. Didn't even get a discussion on it on the floor of either chamber. What did the legislature, though, do with budgets? On the one hand, you have the people wanting strict spending limits. The legislature did nothing on that. So instead, the legislature just controlled themselves, right? That they were good, diligent stewards of the people's money. Well, according to the Wall Street Journal, comparing all spending in 2011 to all spending in 2013, the Wall Street Journal found 24% increase in state spending from 2011 to 2013. 24% increase in the legislature's spending. That may be many things, but conservative and sustainable it is not. The editorial was headlined, "Texas Goes Sacramento," which, as a native Texan, just made my stomach curl up. And so I called one of the editorial writers there, a friend of mine, Steve Moore, some of you may know from his Club for Growth days, and said, "Steve, please tell me this isn't right, there's a misprint, there's a problem." And he said, "Well, Michael, there is a problem with this." Oh, thank goodness. I know the reality, but as a Texan, you kind of want something else, And he said, "Yeah." He said, we went through, looked at the history, and we can't find, in any modern history anyway, where California increased their spending that much. Great. So we've out-California'd California. Yippee. You and I should not be content with that kind of performance by a Republican, by a near supermajority of Republicans, people who campaign as fiscal conservatives. The other issue I would point you to is an issue that I did not want to ever have to really engage much in, But we started moving in more and more to governance issues, the way government works in some ways. Particularly we started, in fact our group started in many ways with the fiscal transparency movement of making sure the state put all its records online so we could see all spending by state agencies in real time. And it's up and going. Susan comes in very well implementing that. But what we wanted to see happen, this is kind of the us versus them problem in the legislative process, where the people wanted one thing and the legislature wanted to do something else. What the legislature wanted to do, the Democrats and the moderate Republicans, they wanted to take a look and see who is funding the critics. They wanted to be able to intimidate those folks who fund Texas Right to Life, the Homeschool Coalition, my organization, Eagle Forum, all the others. They wanted to peek into the donors of these conservative groups. I think, well, maybe that has some merit, I don't know. Well, according to the Supreme Court, it doesn't. For 60 years of jurisprudence, they don't have that right to do so. Indeed, you might recall why that is. Because in the 1950s, there was a little kerfluffle in Alabama, where this nice little African-American lady wanted to sit down on the bus, and some white guys said, we don't want you sitting there, move. And she said, I don't want to move. And they went back and forth, then it kind of became a thing. Some of you may have heard about it in the newspapers. The state of Alabama was none too impressed with the fact that the NAACP came in and started naming names. So which legislators were good on fixing the laws and who were bad on fixing the laws. And they campaigned, they used the media of the day and other things. And so Alabama wanted to find out who was funding this, who was doing this, who was behind this. And everyone got the joke. The legislators in Alabama, they wanted to be able to economically punish the critics. And those who they couldn't economically punish, of course, they wanted to give the names to their no-toothed brothers-in-law to go put on white robes and burn things in people's front yards. Everyone got what they were really trying to do. So NAACP righteously and correctly said, this is wrong. Went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed. And in fact, in case after case after case after case after case, over the intervening 60 years, the Supreme Court continued to reaffirm that the state government does not have the right to ask nonprofits for the names of their donors. And that's exactly what the state Senate wanted to do. Kel Seliger, liberal Republican from Amarillo, he wanted to be able to dig in to see those names. The Senate passed his legislation in the way only the Senate can do things where they just pass stuff without reading it, without paying attention to it. They just pass it out. The state Senate makes a great case for a unicameral. Familiar with Nebraska's experience. So the state Senate pushed this out, and after hearing from various groups and various people, the senators the next morning did the first time in state history, they recalled the legislation. 2/3 of the Senate voted to recall that legislation. The Texas House did nothing. They ignored the recall. They grabbed the legislation, Joe Strauss and Charlie Guerin, your Sarah Davis, and they ramrodded through the legislation in lightning speed. They wouldn't take up pro-life legislation. They wouldn't take up spending limits, but they would take up legislation to be able to allow them to silence their critics. Imagine how that works. So that legislation flies the process with the Democrats and the minority of the Republican caucus voting it out, and the governor vetoed it, fortunately. You can, if you want to read a great veto message, go read Rick Perry's veto message of SB 346. It's a fantastic explanation of why we need to work diligently against against intimidation in the political process of people exercising their right to petition government. Fantastic veto message. But all of these fights, I would suggest to you, point to a problem of we keep electing the wrong folks. We keep electing people who campaign with one set of, they campaign telling us one thing, but they legislate doing something else. They tell us they're pro-life, pro-God, pro-gun, whatever. And in Austin, as Jim said, they just hope they don't ever have to take a stand on it. So they can continue telling us what they're doing, what they believe, even if they're not willing to fight for it. You and I need to be arguing for fighters. You and I need to be fighting a fighting to ensure that we get folks who are going to start demanding transparency. Not transparency in the government sense, but transparency in their records, transparency in their voting. Let's see who's with. I don't mind losing a fight. I've never minded losing a fight. What I do mind is not being allowed to have the fight. We should demand they let us have the fight. So we can see who's for us and against us. Who's really for the things that when they campaign, they say are there for. Until we have that, everything else is fiction. Everything else is only so much fluff and circumstance. You and I have to demand greater transparency in the political process, in the governing process, so that you and I can hold them accountable during the election seasons.